Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Continuous Quality Innovation Series. We're going to be talking about scalable and secure testing, preparing for big holiday season events or any big releases that you might have throughout the year. We're going to be talking a bit today with Marcus and Anders about the experiences they have had in this space, the learnings, and hopefully be able to give you some good tips and considerations as you're all preparing for maybe the holiday season launch or any other launch throughout the year. Some of you might have heard us introduce ourselves at the beginning of the call, but I'm Jenna. I'm on the Sauce Labs team in product marketing, focused on some of our products like insights and visual, and some of our verticals like retail. I'll toss it over to Marcus for a little intro.
Hi, I'm Marcus. I've been in test automation, test architecture for over 20 years now, in the QA function some way or another. Started off in video games and moved into a deep database ETL transactions, which is kind of weird, and then moved to QA. I've been involved with Selenium projects basically since its inception, and I also have a lot of experience in the retail space, which I'll talk about during this webinar.
Anders?
And I'm Anders Wallgren. I've worked for over 20 years with lots of Agile and DevOps team, focusing a lot on the tooling and the processes and the workflows around that. And so I've had lots and lots of exposure to lots of different teams, especially in retail and finance and other kind of industries where risk management is a really important thing that you have to worry about, especially around the holidays if you're retail. So. Really glad to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
Awesome. Thank you both. And to kind of just give a high level, I like to always set the scene for everyone and just help you to understand what we're going to be talking about, what you might walk away with. So going to be learning about approaching the different phases of a big release, such as maybe a Black Friday, Cyber Monday big release, catching bugs before they're impacting customers, as Anders was just talking about mitigating risk, and some tips and strategies and considerations you might take, and then scaling software development by leveraging continuous quality. We'll kind of close it out with that. So that's on the agenda for today. And before we get started, I just want to put a number here on the screen and ask the chat here why you think this number might be significant, what you think this number 50 might represent.
It's the 50% off I got on the Prime Day sale yesterday.
Yeah. Oh yeah, there were actually so many good deals.
It's dangerous.
It's not that though.
The number of trillions of requests per second that go through on Black Friday.
These should have been the numbers that we put up here. That's not it. That's a good guess. Okay, we're 50 days until one of the biggest shopping events of the year. In the US here, we call it Black Friday, Cyber Monday. Some of these stats that I'm putting up, they probably aren't that surprising to anyone here, but a big proportion of retailers and big businesses revenue is coming from Black Friday, Cyber Monday, and the big events around the holidays, the big shopping events around the holidays. Predicted to bring in over $21 billion in revenue during this time of year. But this stat always gets me. We conducted some research recently and found that 60% of developers have admitted to releasing untested code to meet deadlines. And so the reason that's so significant today is because we are talking about mitigating risk leading up to a big launch, launching your product and, preparing for anything that might be impacting the customer experience, that might be impacting revenue. And when we think about code being untested, you might be opening yourself up to some risk by not testing the big experiences that are really driving a lot of revenue and the biggest customer experiences. So we're going to be talking about that a little bit today. And although we're talking about, Black Friday, Cyber Monday, holiday season shopping in November and December, I also just want to call out that, we're 130 days until Valentine's Day, 160 days until tax season, summer vacation travel. So whatever vertical you might find yourself in, whatever big release that you're preparing for next, it's always right around the corner. And the content that we're talking about today is really going to be relevant and can be useful for any big release that you're preparing for, whether it be 50 days until Black Friday or whatever's happening next.
I really want to know too, of that 40%, how many of them are lying?
Yeah, no, that would be good. We'll do a follow-up questionnaire. So high level, we'll have Anders talk a little bit about this. We'll have Marcus talk a little bit about this. We'll have a discussion. We would love to hear from you all in the chat, but we'll kind of go through the beginning phases and really what that looks like when you're preparing for a big release, when you're determining the experiences that are most important, prioritization, building a culture of continuous quality, and making sure that, you know, your team is learning from each other. Marcus will talk a little bit about sort of this middle to end phase, and maybe you're tying up some loose ends with your testing, but maybe there are things that you haven't quite yet thought about, maybe a plan for outages, maybe you haven't, you've done a really great job testing your solution, but what about your partners? Maybe they're sending traffic to you, maybe you're sending traffic to them. Have you thought much about that part of your strategy? And then lastly, at the end, your code is done. Strategy for any bugs that are being released and how you can ensure those don't impact your successes. So we have a quick poll. For those of you that have locked your code, for those of you that are planning, how far in advance does your organization implement a code freeze for the holiday shopping season, or maybe if that's not your vertical, any other big launch or big event? How far in advance?
It's interesting because I think some folks don't have a code freeze for good reasons, and some folks
Yeah.
don't have a code freeze for bad reasons.
There's
That's a
more,
good point,
more than one way to
Marcus.
skin that cat.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and Anders, I know we talked about that when we were preparing for this. Like maybe a code freeze really far in advance has some disadvantages. So
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an aspect to that of sort of admitting that you're too afraid to fail to actually, you know, kind of continue to work as you would on a normal daily basis. That's a really hard thing to say, right? A really harsh thing to say. Because really this is about risk management. It's a very reasonable thing to do to kind of lock things down. But I think mindset wise, you want to have the attitude of, hey, we're doing continuous delivery, you know, December 1st and you know, March 1st, they should be no different to us day-to-day basis. Obviously they are for reasons, but I think in the mindset and the vision for how you operate an engineering organization, you just want to, you know, go all in on Agile and DevOps and SRE and those kinds of things, and just make that part of your process. And then back off from that to say, hey, we're really good at delivering software now. What do we need to do to be really good and mitigate risk as we get to the important dates on our calendar?
I want to call out really quickly the results. I think this is really interesting. We have no one who's responded to implementing a code freeze more than 3 months in advance. I think we've heard from some of our super big retailers that they, you know, have a code freeze date that's a little further out, 1 to 3 months, and then less than 1 month. So it's really interesting.
That's good. I mean, that's encouraging in some ways, right?
I think it is. I have a feeling without hard data, but I have a feeling that if we had asked this question 10 years ago, we'd see a few people that have the 3 months in advance, and that I think that shows, you know, the transition to DevOps that the industry has actually seen, and true SRE practices. I think that you know, the company I worked for experienced that transition from 3 months to less than 1. So it's interesting.
Cool. Well, let's get that conversation then started. Anders, I'd love to pass it over to you to talk a little bit about sort of this beginning prepping phases, determining different things that are important. You know, there's a long laundry list, learning from mistakes. You've shared a lot of really great learnings. Would love to get it over.
Yeah, I mean, I think to start with, I think, you know, there's that old chestnut, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. So if you're going to go about this and you have a very important date on your calendar, say Black Friday, then you know, plan around that and understand the things that you need to do in the time going up to that. And I'm not going to talk about timelines and, you know, this many weeks and months before and so on, because that's going to be, as we saw in the poll, different for everyone. But I think, you know, starting out, you know, you definitely want to think about things like, you know, what is your current performance? How do you work under load? How do you work under stress? Do you have good, you know, testing in place for those kinds of things? You know, and obviously Marcus will cover some more of that, but you need to define those metrics. You know, if you're doing SRE, if you're doing site reliability engineering type approaches, you know, what are your metrics? What are the contracts that you're kind of establishing informally or formally with your internal customers and with your customers and your partners for the kind of load and scale and uptime and those kinds of things that you want to guarantee, and then understand how to test for those, right? And it gets very tricky when you're doing load testing. It's very difficult. You know, we work for a large financial company with a large financial company, and their main problem was they had no way to really test at scale because their scale was so big. The best they could do was get to within about 25% of what they were going to see in terms of load that they could simulate. This was probably about a decade ago, so that may well have changed by now. But you know, you have that sort of problem of, you know, how do you sim the world? Well, the world is the sim, right? So it's very difficult to do load testing at the extremes that you might see at a very unusual kind of Black Friday event. So understand how you're going to do that. If you're doing infrastructure as code, you know, declarative infrastructure, make sure you understand how you're going to scale that, how you're going to track that and manage it, and then understand all of the dates that you want to have around when are we going to do feature freezes, when are we going to do code freezes, when are we going to do bug fixes, when are we going to do security fixes, what are the kind of, you know, gates that we want to go through, and how do we know that we're ready to actually lock down, right? And be very careful about that and understand what the process is. And then taking a step back from that sort of process stuff is the cultural aspects of this. And I think one of the great things that Agile and DevOps together, along with, you know, continuous delivery, continuous quality, continuous STAR, has done is sort of really focus on how teams and individuals work together and start to think about, you know, what is the cultural aspects of how we're doing? How do we build a learning culture instead of a blaming culture? And how do we, you know, work so that people are going to bring problems to the fore and stick their hand up and say, hey, I think this is an issue, and know that the messenger is not going to be punished, right? Because there are cultures in companies, and I've seen them up close, where, you know, the messenger gets shot, and that's not a good way to run a software company. That's going to cause grief sooner or later. And I think, you know, I saw really great, interesting examples from one of the largest retailers that we worked with in the past, and you know, you've worn their clothes almost certainly. And their approach was they had global development, right? So they had tons and tons of small teams all over the place. You know, India, Europe, East Coast, West Coast, South America, everywhere. And when we walked into their kind of engineering facility in their main headquarters, they had TVs set up in all the little areas that the individual teams were working in. And those TVs were on with video conferencing all day or all night, depending on, you know, when they were working. And so you had not just kind of the video conference Zoom thing of an hour a day or a little bit in the morning or a little bit in the evening, but they just were in continuous contact for those hours that they overlapped. And, you know, if it was an East Coast, West Coast team, then that was a big overlap. And if it was, you know, West Coast India, well, smaller overlap, obviously. But it was a great kind of thing, because it wasn't one of those things where like you just saw people's backs as they were working all day. People were actually communicating almost as if they were in the same room the whole day. So I think that sort of collaborative approach of how do we work together, you know, to do all of these things is really important. And then I think too, the one of the most important things you gotta understand is when something bad happens, you've already paid the price for that. So now figure out how to learn from it, right? I think, you know, when you have an outage, the outage has already happened. You've already paid the entrance fee for that class where you go learn how to not have an outage that way the next time. So make sure that when you do things like, you know, root causing, which actually is kind of an ugly word these days for safety people. They don't like to talk about root causes because there are always multiple chains of events and those sorts of things when bad things happen. But if you're looking for things that, you know, caused and helped this thing to happen, you know, be very open and learning about that. Be very afraid of getting into sort of a finger pointing kind of thing, because, you know, people are going to clam up and you're not going to learn. And keep in mind, you know, that saying I keep in my head all the time is, you know, the outage has already happened. You've already paid the fee for the class. Now learn from it. And that's really important. And then this notion of continuous quality, which really all wraps up into, you know, continuous delivery, integration, continuous testing, continuous security, you know, continuous STAR, I just call it, because it's all different ways of looking at a similar problem, which is how do we do processes in a way that they're not waterfally? that we're incrementally improving things all the time, that we're making small changes so that if they go wrong, we can roll back or roll forward and do so well. And that's really important. And that's how you get to the point where you're the 1 month code freeze and not the 4 month code freeze, right?
Yeah,
That's really how you get there.
And what I really love that what you were saying, Andres, is just the with how global a lot of companies are, right? That piece about driving creating a collaborative culture and to bring people together, especially, I haven't been in the seat as you have been, Marcus, or you have been, Anders, but I could just sense that it's a stressful time, and to bring people together and to be able to propagate learnings, and someone comes on, even if you're only overlapping for an hour, we figured out X, Y, and Z, pass that off to the next group. So I just really love that piece.
You don't want the first time that you meet and get to know your colleagues to be when the house is on fire.
Yeah. No, that's a really good point. Thank you for sharing. Let's go into middle end. Marcus, you've told me so many stories about the learning, your experience with some of these pieces, but tell us a little bit about maybe when you're sort of finishing up some of the testing and the prioritized items that maybe Anders just walked us through, and how the attendees here and their organizations might be able to think through what can be iterated on during a code freeze if they have one. What other things can you think about testing outside of what's directly in your control, or helping to make sure other partners and solutions? And also, I love your story about preparing for emergencies.
Yeah, I think I want to dovetail right into what Anders was just talking about, and you were doubling down on around this idea of collaboration and working together. And I think that there's kind of a concrete thing that people in test are somewhat uniquely able to do at this point of the planning, which is, we always talk about how can we hold each other accountable? How can we help to make sure that we're all responsible? And what I would say is do that before any disaster happens. The accountability should come a couple of months in advance when you're sitting around a table and you basically propose, you as the QA person, you propose a couple of things. You say, how are we going to test to make sure the site will stay up? How are we going to react if something goes down? And how are we going to make sure that we learn from these things? And before any of those disasters ever happen, you have people, including executives, nodding their heads when you say, this is the sequence of events that we're going to follow in order to deploy new code, test new code, recover from a disaster, and plan for the future. And all of those executives and the people and the directors and the VPs and the developers and other people in test and wherever else they come from, product, they're going to nod their heads and say, yes, this is the plan. And that moment is the moment of accountability where you're actually working with a team and you're collaborating and you're not meeting each other when the house is on fire. So, everyone in the business is now accountable for knowing what to do when something happens, including deploying code during a code freeze or something like that. And the way you decide what is going to be frozen and what's not is you essentially establish what are the revenue dollars attached to this. I mean, it could be just that simple. You could say, is the cart checkout flow the single most important thing? Like if everything on the site dies except for the ability to add a product to the cart and check out and buy it, then maybe we don't need to work so hard to make sure that stuff is rigorously tested in comparison to the cart checkout flow. I'm not saying don't test it. I'm saying focus on the one thing. This is not a time where you want to generate 100% code coverage and hand your CTO a trophy that says, hey, I made it 100%. You want to make sure that those areas that generate revenue for your company and cover risk to your business are the things that are going to be focused on. So if you're working on it, and this is where I have sort of personal experience with it, where I was working on a site where we were a referral customer, coupon code company, referring customers who came in to find a promo code out to other companies. And if they went to those companies and, like clothing retail or something like that, if they used our coupon code, we dropped a cookie on their web browser, and if they bought something, we would get commission on that something because they'd be able to attribute the sale to us as a referrer. And everything about that workflow was critical. And what was not critical was on our site, we also had some social media stuff, and we had the ability to sort of, have an avatar and an icon and edit your your information and the about me stuff. 1% of our users use that, and the CEO wouldn't even take the phone call if someone called and said, hey, this is out during Black Friday. Nobody cares.
Yeah.
Nobody cares.
I
So
love that example because now it's real. I've used that exact same example, except theoretically for many, many years. And now I actually have somebody saying it's happened.
Yeah, no, it's happened. I actually have a story I've told many times on our own podcast where I say, I was very proud of the team who wrote a whole bunch of automated tests around that profile management stuff. And I talked to someone in business intelligence and I said, hey, isn't this team doing great? And they're like, well, yeah, they're doing great at stuff nobody cares about. Like, write 3 tests for that stuff. Don't write 100. Work on the stuff that it matters the most. I mean, as one example, we figured out at one point that I think this was back in the time of Chrome double-digit version, so like Chrome 42 back in 2017, something like that, where I'm just going to pull out an example. This is not a real example, but it's a real example of something that happened, just not specifically the version number. Like Chrome 42 released a new version of the JavaScript interpreter that somehow broke one of the particular code paths that was used to drop the cookie on someone's browser. So we learned one day that we were not making any money on Chrome suddenly. And like, just because of a simple JavaScript change to how the cookie was dropped. And so it's like, okay, that's all hands on deck. That's a big problem. Because
no cookie, no cash.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we hadn't at that point gone through as a testing team and identified what is the thing that would wake the CEO up in the middle of the night. And once we figured that stuff out, I mean, the CEO actually got to know the names of the individual testers on the team because he understood how critical we were to that process of identifying and protecting the revenue stream and protecting the business. This is a public company. Something like that comes out, our stock tanks. I mean, it's absolutely critical. So focus on that. And then the other thing that we had to worry about was, since we were referring people to other companies, if those retailers went down, it cost us money. So if they're having an outage on Black Friday because they didn't do their testing diligently, doesn't matter how good our site is, we depend on them for revenue. So at some point we were picking like our top 5 revenue partners and saying, we make this much money from this company, this much money from this company. We're going to try to ask them for a commission increase next year because we want to demonstrate to them how much value we provide. But if their site breaks, what good does it do us? So we lost, I think, 200 grand once because someone's website was down, a retailer, major retailer. So we started to get to the point where we would proactively reach out to them in August and September and say, hey, how can we help you? Because here's what's coming just from us. And here's what we know is coming for you. And they would listen. Some of us tried to start a revenue stream out of it. Didn't work out, but it's fine. We were able to get there and offer some advice and make sure that they were set up for success.
No, I love that. I think it's and that's why we included it in this part of our slideware, right? It's like, okay, maybe that's not something that partners or where you're driving traffic to or getting traffic from is not at the very beginning, or not something you're considering right at the beginning. Maybe it's towards the middle, towards the end, when you've wrapped up a couple of things. But I think it's so crucial. And I think it's really great. Another way to tie back to what we were talking about, Anders, with collaborative, iterative, propagating learnings to others. I mean, why not take some of that and help others out that are bringing you revenue, that you're bringing them revenue. You don't want their sites to go down. They don't want yours to. They don't want bugs on either side. So, absolutely. And then I love your story. I
love that notion too of not all features are the same. They're not our children. We don't love them all equally. And there's a similar concept in security engineering of, you probably don't want to spend $1 million to protect a $5 asset. That's probably not a good use of your time and resources. And it's always good, I think, when we're talking about engineering principles and sort of theoretical things, to just keep ourselves grounded in we live in resource constrained environments, and we will not test every feature completely, and we will not have 100% code coverage, and we will not load test every single way that we can, and all of those kinds of things. And really the important part to do there is just stack rank the things that you need to do and make sure that the most important ones get done, as soon and as well as possible.
Yeah, exactly. And then when something does happen, to what Jenna was alluded to, number 3 here is when something does go wrong. We used to do a practice run of what the academic testing community calls targeted fault insertion. We would have a site that's up and running in a testing environment, and then we would kill it, kind of like chaos engineering, but we deliberately did it at an appointed time. And we went through a dry run of what we would actually do to recover the site in an emergency. But the first thing that happened that was an automated redirect that would switch on our DNS was we would set up a very, very basic static version of our website that contained some number of coupons that we knew were going to be a guaranteed success. And they were completely static, hosted on S3 with CloudFront, very, very basic. And they would drop the cookie, they would refer you out to the site, and we would still continue to make money. And nobody would, like, I think a large percentage of customers wouldn't even know that the main site was down, because all they're there to do is get there, get the promo code, get out.
Yep.
So, I mean, it got to the point where we monetized our 404 page. If you went to a page that was broken, we put offers right there. And I think there's no reason, and I would almost say there's no excuse not to continue to let revenue flow if even if your site is down and your most critical performance attributes are not working.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think too, somebody taught me once a long, long time ago that your backup strategy doesn't matter. What matters is your restore strategy.
Yeah, your recovery.
And if you never tested your restores, you don't have backups. Right?
That's right.
Yep.
And I think we worked with a very large bank a few years ago. Again, you've worn their clothing. No, I'm just kidding. But they had 3 data centers, one of which was live at any one time. And once a quarter, they failed over to the next one. Every quarter, they failed over to the next one. And they just bounced around those 3 throughout the years. And they just know that if they ever have their data center is a smoking hole in the ground, they'll be fine, right? Because they've done the recovery. I would say if you haven't done that sort of dry run or dress rehearsal on whether it's backing up or restoring from backups or failing over to another data center or another region or zone, then you don't have a strategy. You're going to fail. So
it's expensive to put that together, but it's dwarfed by the possibility of an outage on the most critical day.
Yeah. Again, it's subject to that whole notion of don't spend $1 million to protect a $5 asset, but absolutely. Yeah.
And everything here we're talking about is just like over and over, just talking about this theme of mitigating risk, right? And protecting the most important experiences on some of these events or releases or big days that are driving so much traffic, so much revenue. And so, you just continue to hear us talk about different strategies and learnings and things that you all can do to also mitigate that sort of risk. Some things being smaller than others, some having more impact. But now I want to transition to, okay, we're nearing the end. Code is locked. I think you both have shared some good learnings about maybe for those in the room here that did indicate that they have a code freeze date before a big release. What can you recommend organizations to think about once the code is locked? What else can be done to stay productive and to ensure that we're still kind of thinking about continuous quality? And you both have talked about different things on this list, whether it be like leveraging feature flags or canary, and we've talked about testing in production. Question mark?
I think one of the great things about feature flags is you don't have to redeploy, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
And I think we all have to recognize that a deployment is a risk, right? You can mitigate that risk, you can drive it down, you can get really good at doing it. As the old saying goes, it hurts when I do deployments. Well, do more of them, right? That's really the only way you get better at them. But feature flags are great because if you do ship something and turn it on and it's not working, or maybe it's not working in Maryland, but it's working fine in California. Feature flags are great for that kind of thing of turning things on, turning things off, and doing things like maybe testing to a small subset, testing to a particular region, those sorts of things. So you can actually, you can have code live in production and then turn it off without doing another, or turn it on without doing a deployment. That's a really powerful thing.
Well said. I think that the oft overlooked magic power of feature flags is the ability to fix code by just clicking a little radio button. I mean, when you deploy code and it's a stinker, deploying a fix or rolling back a fix is just as difficult as doing the deployment in the first place. So if it's a long involved process of it, then if you've done it with feature flags, the undeploy is just turning it off. And it's kind of critical to understand that. Now, there's a couple categories of things that can't fit under feature flags. I think one of the common ones, and this is where I'm a little bit maybe showing my age, is adding a column to a database table. That's generally something you got to shut everything down in order to do. Not so much true these days with Mongo and all sorts of new database technologies, but it is something to consider. There's a class of issues around infrastructure config, database configuration that you should be really, really gentle with and can't really put behind a feature flag. But it's important, once again, get the head nod and say, these are the categories of code we will put out to the site. These are the categories of features we will put behind flags. And this is the category of things that we simply will not do during code freeze.
Yeah. Or get into that mode of where you deploy schema changes before you deploy the code changes, or even before you enable the code changes in the feature flags. But that's an engineering discipline, and I think you're sort of hinting at that a little bit. That's a very difficult engineering discipline, right? It's tricky to do right. It's easier when you have the sort of less kind of schema restrictive type data stores, as opposed to, you know, SQL constraints and all of those kinds of things. But yeah, that's very important. And the more you can write your code so that your data and your code are kind of have a little bit of slack in them, where old code doesn't break with new data and new code doesn't break with old data, you're in a good position then where you can sort of roll forward a little bit, roll back a little bit, and do those kinds of things. And I think in general too, let's say you're not using feature flags, rolling forward is almost always better than rolling back, right? And if you just need to do a bug fix to fix something, roll forward. You know, if it's a giant smoking hole in the ground and you do need to roll back, you do need to roll back. But, you know, hopefully if that happens to you, you're going to spend a lot of time learning from that and figuring out how to prevent that the next time, and figuring out the things that led up to that. But that sort of, I mean, that's actually good lead into things like canary builds, you know? You know, is there a way that we can do more kind of advanced on the bleeding edge testing that isn't just kind of in the, you know, in the back office, so to speak, testing, and be able to get things out there earlier. Those dovetail a lot with feature flags, because it's really one of the things that it's really about is get stuff out there as early as possible, possibly to the right audience, you know, maybe the more committed audience or the friendlier audience or a particular region or those sorts of things, and get stuff out there, and get it tested as soon as possible. Because, you know, testing in production is actually definitely something you can do. It's not as ugly a phrase as it would have been 5 or 10 years ago, when everybody was testing in production, but they just didn't know it. You know, I think that's really important.
Canary builds feature really well in testing in production, simply because you can set the test that you're running in production to work against the experiment, you know, and you can make sure that they are working against the experiment and that data is flowing correctly. And you could test all the end-to-end flows downstream and stuff like that. And I think canary builds are, the good news about canary builds is that most people already have this mechanism in the form of A/B testing, which is done to create lift in marketing and lift in engagement. You've already got a built-in mechanism then to deploy new features to an experimental build around feature and functionality, and not just for marketing. I honestly think that canary builds and A/B testing are exactly the same thing. It's just that when we say A/B testing, we're talking more about business impact. Canary builds is more about releasing features. So you probably already have this mechanism. So if you're not doing it already, it's, you know, it's worth it. It's worth a shot.
Yeah.
And error monitoring is obviously, you know, key. Preach to the choir here, I'm sure. But we had an interesting kind of example of where you need to do error monitoring where maybe it's not as expected. And that was in one of the products I worked on. We had an extensive test suite, right? Lots and lots of system tests as well, because there were many integrations and those sorts of things. And one thing that we didn't do for a long time was validate that the logs being produced by the server components that were being tested, that they weren't full of things that they ought not to be full of, like stack traces and errors and, oh, I don't know what to do here kind of log messages, you know, those sorts of things. And once we started doing that, that just led to a whole sort of stability bump across the way, because now we were seeing bugs during testing that we were basically ignoring before. We just didn't know it. So error monitoring, testing in production, all of those things kind of dovetail a little bit into that kind of shift left methodology, right? And that can go all the way to, look, when you're running your tests, instrument the hell out of that. Monitor it the same way you would monitor production, right? Know the kinds of signals that you're going to see coming out of there and the ones that you don't want to see coming out of there, so that you can fix them before you go into production. And then, of course, you know, continue to do that once you're in production.
Yeah, one thing that we learned recently is that we hooked up our error monitoring product into our mobile product here at Sauce. And we learned that something like 20% of tests that were flagged as passing tests actually had some form of crash or stack trace being reported to them in a way that the customer didn't even surface to the UI, so the test wouldn't even pick up on it. So it's an extra layer of telemetry and the ability to give people like a superpower to say, hey, I'm actually seeing errors here that aren't being surfaced to the user. Does that mean there's a slowdown? Does that mean that there's some unexpected behavior that's not being picked up by the test? So it's called into question a lot of interesting things, and I think bringing a whole lot more value.
Yep. And I think too, and this is kind of a general kind of process pipeline comment, but when you're let's assume that you're automating as much of your testing as you can, because you should be. Then you also want to pay attention to this notion of the goal of testing isn't just to find badness, it's to prove and assert goodness, right? And kind of anecdotally, something that happened to us as well, we very early on in the product cycle for one of the products I worked on, Electric Flow, we weren't counting the number of tests that were running in the pipeline. And for a while, we had a test suite that had been disabled unintentionally, had been disabled locally and then committed into the source repository. And so all of a sudden, we were running like half the amount of tests that we thought we were. So we added a feature which just shows you the number of tests that run. How many failed, how many had warnings, those sorts of things. But we were always telling you how many errors there were. We were never telling you how many passed. And that was a lesson we learned, that quality just isn't about looking for problems, it's looking for goodness as well. Because otherwise there's also problems that you just aren't seeing.
Yeah, and to that point, also your testing should be fallible in that if a test should fail, it should fail. I actually had a story once where I had Titus Fortner loves to rib me about this story because it happened to me. I had a test suite of about 800 tests that were working against a website. And I think one day the website was down and I got a Slack from my manager who's like, hey, the website's down. I'm like, yeah, I know, whatever. He's like, well, what's curious about that is that the tests are still running and 36 of them passed. So our tests were not engineered to fail when they should have failed.
Oh, interesting.
And that's something that you need to, your test needs to be able to fail. And if it doesn't, then you're actually sort of misleading the company about the coverage that you actually have in place. So shocking moment, never happened again, I can promise.
See?
And then just as a general commentary on testing, flaky tests are from the devil. There is nothing more corrosive to the quality of a product than tests that are flaky.
Or the confidence in your organization. I mean, people don't trust QA when tests are flaky. People don't care about the output of test automation.
It becomes the boy who cried wolf, or all the other sort of Greek mythologies and so on that you can think of.
You get rid of your flaky tests and you'll find that magically your developers will start caring when they do fail.
Yeah.
It's just a magic thing that happens.
100% true thing.
Magic?
Anybody who's listening to this, believe it, because it absolutely is true. Do it. Get rid of your flaky tests. Turn them off if you have to.
I've seen the light. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
That's what maybe we should have just done the whole webinar about it.
That's a whole hour at least right there.
Right? Another poll for the attendees here. With a launch day quickly approaching, we wanted to ask the group, what is your strategy to ensure any missed bugs don't impact your success? We're going to talk a little bit about some strategies that you might consider, but would love to hear from the group here, what you might be thinking about.
I like the fact that it's a multi-select, except for the last one, I hope. But, I've been in that situation before, for sure. I mean, we had to kind of invent what we were doing when we were small and scrappy.
There you go. Everyone's at a different, point in their journey. We don't judge. Looks like a lot of people did choose multiple. So that's good. That's good to have multiple strategies. Well, we will continue then I put a little, hint here that we're going to be talking about next, which is this idea of continuous quality. So this has kind of come up, I feel like, through the discussion today, but I want to open up a question to, again, the people in the room, but Anders and Marcus to talk a little bit about, we think about all the different experiences that can be tested and really thinking about, like, some bugs might escape, maybe if that's part of your strategy, but what is the right percentage of escape bugs? Maybe it depends on your vertical, if you're in a certain regulated industry, or another industry, maybe you have a different take on this, but, you know, thinking about all the way over on the 0% side, right? If your goal is to have 0% bugs escaping into production, that would be really difficult. I don't even know if you could ever even release an application or anything.
Only if you work for NASA.
Sure, yes, and that probably is appropriate, speaking of. And then we go all the way over to the right, and if you're releasing 100% bugs, that'd be pretty crazy. You probably wouldn't even be able to use a website or app. So what we're trying to get at here is we're trying to find the balance of you're trying to meet release deadlines, right? But you're also trying to ensure that you're releasing high quality software for your users. But you have a deadline in place. So is there a percentage that your organization has discussed? Do you all have a take on this question that we've kind of posed to the group here about, you know, what is more reasonable? Is there an exact amount? Do you have any thoughts, the two of you?
42.
42. Okay, there you go.
No, I mean, I think in some ways, you know, Mark has kind of alluded to this in terms of not all bugs are the same, right? A bug in the, you know, how I upload my avatar to my profile and a bug in the flow for putting products into the cart and checking out are obviously two very, very different bugs in terms of the impact that the bug has. So I think it makes a lot of sense to talk about this in terms of, you know, there are bugs that we care a lot about, there are bugs that we care less about. You know,
Yep.
that's just a fact. And then
Yep.
and then work on that assumption and really try to focus on, you know, again, going back to what we were talking about before of, you know, understand upfront the kinds of things that are going to result in a call to a VP or the CEO in the middle of the night when it happens. And then work backwards from that to make sure that those are the kinds of things that you're looking for and that you're doing the right things to find them, you're doing the right things to fix them and get those out there. Because, you know, zero bugs just isn't going to happen, right? Even of the ones that you really care a lot about, they're going to happen. So the flip side of that coin is, you know, accept the inevitable. There will be problems, right? It kind of comes back to the whole thing of your backup strategy is not nearly as important as your restore strategy. And the idea there is there's going to be bugs, right? There's going to be, you know, nasty, gnarly, revenue impacting, phone call at 3 a.m. in the morning kind of bugs. Have a process for that. Know what you're going to do, because I guarantee you when that phone rings at 3 in the morning, you're going to be completely freaked out, right? Yep. And if you have something to go back and look at, that makes sense. And actually the NASA example is a good example there, because one of the ways that they you know, take the Apollo 13 example, right? They have a really serious accident while they're on the way to the moon, and now they got to figure out how to get these guys back, right? Yep. Alive. And the way they did that was they had processes. They got a bunch of people in a room, gave them all the things that were on the spacecraft, and said, "Here, you got to fix the problem. You got to fix the problem of how we fit the square CO2 scrubber into the round CO2 scrubber hole, right? Fit the square peg into the round hole." That's why those guys didn't die, because they worked the problem. They worked the problem. They had procedures and processes. Same for airline pilots, for pilots, right? You have an engine out. Well, the first thing you do is you reach for the procedure manual and the quick checklist, and you flip to the engine out checklist and you go through it, because nobody can be expected to kind of work from memory and muscle memory when something bad like that happens. It's very important to have the steps in front of you, because you're frazzled, you're stressed, you're trying to work a problem. It's really important to have the steps in front of you at all times. That's as important as how far on the spectrum.
Yeah, it's hard to hard to choose a number. And I know we have some strategies. Marcus, do you also have a number? Is it 42%?
I mean, always. But I think it's what I'm thinking about is that this number, be prepared for this number to change over time, because I can think of two examples. I'll try to keep it real brief, but basically there was a long time ago, 15 years ago, I was subscribed to a newsletter by mistake. Someone put me on a newsletter for a bank, and I don't know why. I kept trying to unsubscribe, and every time I unsubscribed, I would get this ASP.NET 500 server error when I tried to unsubscribe to it. Well, then Congress passed the Can Spam Act, which would fine people on a per incident basis whether or not they were properly unsubscribed to marketing emails. And that they fixed the page real quick after that, because it went from a zero, like a Sev 5 to a Sev 0. We're going to get fined if we don't fix this. And the other example I would say is also accessibility. It's always top of mind for me, but accessibility right now is undergoing a shift from you should do this because it's the right thing to do to June 28th of 2025. If you do business in the European Union and your software isn't accessible, you're going to get fined. So this number can change over time in the category of what you're prioritizing. And I think you just need to make sure you understand your regulatory compliance that you're subject to, and other attributes like that, to make sure that you understand where you fit in various things.
Yeah, I mean, those things all happen too around, GDPR and privacy,
Yep.
and you can go further back to Sarbanes-Oxley when those kinds
Yep.
of things change and all of that. So yeah, the ocean that you swim in occasionally changes its nature. So that does have an impact on this.
There you go. Yeah, this number is not this is more of a, there's not an actual number here. I'm sort of joking a little bit and when asking for an exact number, but it's it's meant to open up a discussion and a conversation about, is it really right to be aiming for 0? Is there probably some leeway depending on the different experiences, or maybe within different parts of your process? But also what we wanted to talk about is when you're thinking about releasing and boosting that confidence and mitigating that risk, right? Going back to the theme of our whole session today, the way that we're thinking about it here at Sauce Labs, and maybe some of you are thinking about this as well, as sort of these evolving test strategies to be able to, more easily meet release deadlines and be more efficient, but also reducing that risk of those bugs that we're releasing in production and that percentage that we're talking about. I don't know, Marcus, if you have anything to add to this slide in terms of, traditionally where we were thinking about testing and then releasing, and you kind of are waiting a bit longer to get something. It takes a bit more time, right? And then you release and deliver that value. Then you kind of move into this idea of testing and then introducing mobile beta distribution, getting some users in a little bit earlier to deliver value earlier to a subset of customers and learn. And then we're kind of getting into what we're talking about with modern continuous delivery, continuous quality, adding in that sort of idea of mobile beta distribution and then error monitoring in production. And so that's really where we find that value is delivered earlier. You have a opportunity to meet those, release deadlines a little bit easier because you've implemented some other testing strategies. But anything to add here when we're talking about continuous quality?
Well, the thing I would add is, and I'd be very curious to get Anders' response to this, is I think that this is finally getting us out of theory crafting and hoping that all the SRE philosophies around SLOs, SLIs, error budgets, and stuff like that can actually start to play in a real sense with our SDLC, because we've been theory crafting around it for a long time. A lot of people are actually doing it, but this is where it really starts to matter and starts to show effect. I'm curious if Anders agrees with me on that.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, the really, I think when the acceleration happens in terms of productivity or reliability and all of those things and engineering teams and in terms of path to production, is when you start to be able to kind of close some of those feedback loops so that the experience that the SRE has relative to the SLOs, SLAs, service level objectives, service level agreements, and those sorts of things, if you're not familiar with the SRE lingo, once those start feeding back into the engineering organizations, the product management organizations, and all of those kinds of things, then that's when you start to see the improvement. And I think I'm not a big fan of things like maturity models and that sort of stuff, but for sure, one of the things you notice is when an engineering team starts to kind of close the feedback loops from their monitoring back into their development and those sorts of things, you see a big kind of boost in productivity or reliability, or whatever you choose to focus on at that point. So I think we're definitely getting there and getting better at it. In some ways in the early days. I mean, we're still crawling, starting to walk a little bit as an industry, I would think, after 40, 50, 60 years here.
Yeah, I tend to agree about the maturity models. There's kind of a judgment implicit in the term. And I think that what we need to do is decide what I always have. We don't have a diagram for this, but I always try to think on the spectrum of between highly versioned software and continuous software. Where do you need to fall for your business? Because it's, if you're a space shuttle, you're going to be versioned. If you're a mobile app, you're going to be versioned less. If you're a retail website, you could probably be pretty continuous all the time. And then on the other spectrum is, do you manage based on coverage, or do you manage based on risk? And that, so between these two axes, you can put your point on the line and say, here's where we are right now, and then point to here's where we need to go. And at that point, you can call that a maturity model if that's the frame you choose to look at it. But that matches your context of how you should run your business.
That's a data-driven kind of maturity model, right?
Yeah.
So many maturity models are, not that I want to make this about that, but there's no data to it, right? And so everybody just kind of wants they want the certificate on the wall. That's more important to them than the actual underlying notion of what it is that you're trying to do. And that's why I don't like maturity models, because they make it more about what it looks like rather than what it actually is. But
the impact is, I've been enjoying this conversation so much, but we only have 5 minutes left, and I want to make sure that we can an example from one of our own customers who's really implementing this this concept of continuous quality, which is our customer Walmart, very relevant to big holiday season shopping, Black Friday, Cyber Monday. Walmart is a customer that came to us who was, having some challenges with manual testing and taking a lot of time and a lot of resources, which was then impacting negatively impacting their ability to deploy more frequently. And that was kind of, then impacted their ability to, keep up with app development and all of the experiences that their customers were expecting to receive. So Walmart is working with Sauce Labs, and they're a really amazing customer of ours that are leveraging our infrastructure and our testing solutions across the software development lifecycle and the wonderful data to be able to be more strategic about the testing that they're doing. And with that, they're able to really save time and effort and resources from their development team and accelerate their development cycles so that they can focus on some of these other areas that the team was talking about today, right? Partner solutions maybe, or making sure their site doesn't go down. What's the strategy if it does? All of these things. So really just wanted to make this a little more real, right? Tangible, with an example from one of our customers who's just seen really, really great success with implementing this idea of continuous quality.
I think we do have a couple of questions in the chat.
I like the second one. I'll go with that just because we don't have much time. What is the biggest challenge or issue you've had to handle leading up to or right after a major release? I'll keep mine to 5 seconds. We had certifications, secure certs on a DNS server expire the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. I will bow out now. That's because
you're not going to tell us what you you're just going to leave it as that.
Oh, I mean, that was the issue. I mean, replacing those certificates,
challenge, not the solution.
Oh yeah. Well, the solution is fix the certs. It's a 5-minute fix, but identifying the root cause and the fact that this happened the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, insane. So, what about you, Anders?
I think we had one release where we released slightly, and this was not SaaS software, so it's a little bit of a different example, but we released shortly before a major OS release, and it just didn't work at all on the new OS release. And that was just one of those, fail to plan to fail kind of a thing, where we weren't paying attention to what was changing in the architectures and the platforms that we were working on. That's another thing you got to keep track of. So add that to the list.
Yeah. We've covered a lot of content today. We are actually running out of time, but don't you worry, because you can be asking more of these questions to our team. We have so many great resources here. You can actually learn a bit more by booking some time with our experts here at Sauce. We've created some great content and materials to support what we were talking about in today's session that you're able to download. But I think this was really great. Thank you both, Anders, Marcus. Thanks to everyone joining us today. We hope that you were able to walk away with some really great learnings that you can implement in the coming weeks and months and before any big major release.